I'm Alex Rivera, investigative journalist, and today we begin our deep dive into the hidden world of Jimi Hendrix. Not the stage icon, the feedback wizard who set guitars ablaze at Monterey. No. The man behind the curtain, the one who navigated shadows while the spotlights blinded the world. It started with a frantic phone call. September 18, 1970. A small apartment in Notting Hill, London. Monika Dannemann, his girlfriend of 18 months, dials the ambulance. Her voice, steady at first, cracks. Jimi Hendrix lies unresponsive on the bed. Barbiturates in his system, 9 Vesparax tablets, 18 times the recommended dose. He'd taken them hours earlier, chasing sleep after a night of wine and conversation. The paramedics arrive, but it's too late. Asphyxiation. The world would soon mourn the rock god. But in that quiet room before the headlines, lay the culmination of a private unraveling few ever glimpsed. Rewind. James Marshall Hendrix, born Johnny Allen in Seattle, 1942, grew up in a house where silence was a refuge. Poverty gripped the family. His parents, Al and Lucille, fought often, their voices echoing through thin walls laced with alcohol. Young Jimmy would slip into a closet, curling up amid coats and shadows, waiting for the storm to pass. Short bursts of chaos. Long stretches of uncertainty. His mother's death in 1958 from cirrhosis hit hard. Al didn't let the boys attend the funeral. Instead, he poured them whiskey, his way of dulling the edge. Siblings scattered to foster care. Leon, his brother, in and out like a ghost. Isolation crept in early, a quiet companion. Publicly, Hendrix exploded onto the scene in 1966, relocating to London, forming The Experience. Crowds screamed. Albums soared. But behind closed doors, routines anchored him. Nights alone with his guitar, hours of practice by ear, blues riffs from Muddy Waters, B.B. King. He'd tuned down to E-flat, bending strings easier, his fingers a blur in dim hotel rooms. Amphetamines fueled the sessions, cannabis softened the edges. Decisions made in solitude. Enlisting in the Army in 1961 to dodge jail for joyriding stolen cars. Stationed at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. There the obsession deepened. He begged for his guitar to be shipped from home. Peers hid it as a joke, he pleaded. Duties neglected. Bed checks failed. Naps on watch. Discharged in 1962 for unsuitability. Power on stage, but in barracks, control slipped away. Relationships? Controlled, fleeting, laced with tension. Betty Jean Morgan, his high school sweetheart, her name painted on his first electric guitar, a Supro Ozark. She kept it safe in Seattle while he served. Then Faye Pridgeon in Harlem, 1964. She sheltered him, fed him when gigs paid pennies. Support in the shadows. In London, Kathy Etchingham from 1966. They shared a Brook Street flat, laughter, music. But fame's weight pressed. He moved back in January 1969, seeking stability. Yet cracks showed. One drunken night, jealousy flared. He struck girlfriend Carmen Barrero with a vodka bottle. Stitches required. A rare outburst buried under tour schedules. The world saw the charismatic showman. Privately, substances amplified fears, abandonment from childhood, perhaps echoed in band fractures. Unsettling moments piled up, unseen. 1968, Gothenburg Hotel. Drunk, he smashed a window, cut his hand. Arrested, fined. Quiet aftermath in a cell. 1969, Toronto Airport. Customs found heroin and hashish in his luggage. He claimed a fan planted it. Acquitted after trial. But the fear lingered, exploitation by those around him. Managers like Chas Chandler quit in frustration over chaotic studio sessions. Mike Jeffrey handled finances, but tensions simmered. Hendrix opened Electric Lady Studios in 1970, a $300,000 loan from Warner Brothers. A bid for control. Yet unreleased tapes stacked up, lyrics and poems scribbled in Greenwich Village apartments, later whisked away by employees after his death. Contrast sharpened in the final years. Stadiums packed, highest paid musician by 1969. Woodstock's anthem, distorted and defiant. But isolation gnawed. He confided in a 1967 survey, personal ambition? Have my own style of music. See my mother again. A quiet ache buried. Nights on the road, phone calls to old friends like Billy Davis, met in 1959. Habits deepened, LSD first tried around 1966, cocaine on tour. Decisions in closed rooms. Forming band of gypsies to answer Black Power calls, but legal disputes dissolved it. Sabotage whispers, unresolved. And then that last night. September 17th. Back at Monika's flat after a party. Wine shared. Conversation drifts. He pops the pills for sleep. She retires to another room. Morning comes. She checks on him. No response. The call goes out. But questions hang. Why the delay? What words were left unsaid in the dark? Don't forget to subscribe and like if you like this story. The official timeline moves quickly after that call, too quickly for comfort. Paperwork, pronouncements, causes of death reduced to clinical phrasing. Yet when you linger in the margins interviewing first responders decades later, reading transcripts that never make documentaries, you notice the pauses. The gaps where no one seems certain who entered the room first, or how long Hendrix had been lying on his side, or why the bedding had been changed before authorities arrived. Small details easily dismissed, yet they accumulate like dust in an abandoned studio, coating everything with unease. London in late 1970 was thick with exhaustion. The counterculture had aged overnight. Psychedelia had curdled into paranoia, and the music industry had grown sharper teeth. Hendrix, for all his fame, was still drifting between hotels, borrowed flats, other people's schedules. Friends recall him speaking more softly in those weeks, as if conserving energy. He complained of insomnia, of feeling watched not by fans but by expectations. Contracts, managers, people who spoke for him in rooms he wasn't allowed into. He was worth millions, yet often didn't know how much money he actually had, or where it went. Control, the one thing he chased relentlessly in sound, eluded him in life. In the days before his death, Hendrix made gestures that felt like quiet preparation. He visited Electric Lady Studios late at night, running his hands along the walls, listening to how footsteps echoed in the hallways. He talked about moving back to New York permanently, about stripping his music down, fewer overdubs, more breathing room. He carried a notebook everywhere, filling it with fragments, lyrics, stage designs, phone numbers with no names attached. One page simply read, in uneven handwriting, "I need rest." No punctuation. No explanation. People around him noticed the withdrawal. Not dramatic despair, but a thinning presence. He'd sit through conversations without interrupting, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the room. When asked about upcoming tours, he deflected. When pressed about Band of Gypsies, he shrugged. There was a sense that Hendrix was stepping back from a version of himself the world demanded he keep performing. Fame had turned into a role he could no longer inhabit comfortably, and there was no understudy. That final evening unfolds slowly when you resist the urge to rush it. A party, yes, but subdued. Wine instead of harder substances. Laughter that faded early. Witnesses remember Hendrix as polite, even distant, thanking hosts, excusing himself. Back at the apartment, the city sounds filtered through thin walls, cars passing, voices drifting up from the street. London never truly sleeps, but that night it seemed to hold its breath. He took the Vesparax tablets not with urgency, but routine. Something prescribed months earlier, something meant to quiet the mind. No suicide note. No dramatic gesture. Just a man who wanted unconsciousness. And yet, questions persist because the circumstances refuse to settle. Medical reports conflict on timelines. Statements change subtly over the years. Friends who should have been called weren't. Others learned through radio broadcasts. The flat was cleaned. Clothing disappeared. Tapes and writings were removed from various locations before inventories were completed. Each action can be explained individually. Together, they form a pattern that invites suspicion without offering resolution. In the weeks after Hendrix's death, the machinery of legacy roared to life. Posthumous albums assembled from unfinished tracks. Lawyers argued over rights. Managers spoke on his behalf one last time. But the man himself slipped further from view, becoming a symbol, a cautionary tale, a myth polished smooth by repetition. What remained unexamined was the quieter truth. A gifted, sensitive individual shaped by early instability, navigating an industry that rewarded excess while punishing vulnerability. As I sit with those who knew him, not the stars but the drivers, engineers, girlfriends, neighbors, a different Hendrix emerges. A man who flinched at raised voices. Who hated confrontation. Who stayed awake all night perfecting sounds no one asked for. Who carried childhood losses into every room he entered. His death, when seen through this lens, feels less like an ending and more like an unresolved pause, a note left hanging without resolution. And somewhere between the official story and the whispered doubts, between what was documented and what was quietly erased, lies a truth that still refuses to surface, one that forces us to ask not just how Jimi Hendrix died, but what, exactly, he was trying to escape in those final, silent hours. What complicates everything is how quickly the narrative hardened. Within hours, a version of events was already being repeated by police, by press agents, by people whose livelihoods depended on the myth remaining intact. Accidental overdose. Tragic but simple. The kind of ending the public could process and move past. Yet when you speak to those who were close enough to see the strain in real time, they describe something far more unstable, as if Hendrix had been standing on a floor that was quietly giving way beneath him, plank by plank, long before that night in Notting Hill. In the summer of 1970, his days followed an uneven rhythm. He slept late, sometimes not at all. Meals were forgotten, then overindulged. He carried the smell of cigarette smoke and patchouli, his clothes wrinkled, his hair often wrapped in a scarf to keep it out of his eyes. In hotel rooms, he would rearrange furniture obsessively, chasing acoustics, placing chairs against doors, mattresses against walls. Friends assumed it was about sound. In hindsight, it also looked like someone trying to control space itself, to make the world feel less unpredictable. Hendrix talked more openly about fear during this period, though never directly. He spoke in metaphors about waves pulling him under, about engines revving with no brakes. He complained that every decision he made was immediately second-guessed by someone else. His phone rang constantly. Managers, promoters, strangers claiming to be friends. He rarely answered. When he did, conversations were short, polite, and ended abruptly. The sense of being owned, of being consumed, weighed heavily. "They don't hear me when I'm quiet," he reportedly said to an engineer at Electric Lady, half joking, half resigned. There were warning signs that never became headlines. A rehearsal where he simply put the guitar down and walked out, leaving the band frozen mid-song. A night when he locked himself in a bathroom for hours, refusing to respond, only to emerge calm, apologetic, distant. The music press interpreted these moments as eccentric genius. But those closer recognized something else: withdrawal, fatigue, a man retreating inward because outward movement only led to more demands. Even his creative sanctuary, Electric Lady Studios, became a source of pressure. It was supposed to be freedom, his space, his rules. Instead, it turned into another responsibility, another debt, another place where people expected miracles on command. Tapes piled up not because he lacked ideas, but because he couldn't decide which version of himself to commit to vinyl. Blues? Funk? Something darker, quieter, more restrained? Each path felt like a betrayal of someone's expectations. And Hendrix had spent a lifetime avoiding disappointment, even at the cost of himself. After his death, people spoke about his appetite for excess. What they rarely mention is how carefully he rationed moments of calm. Long baths. Silent walks. Hours lying on the floor, listening to records with his eyes closed. He was searching for a kind of stillness he'd known briefly as a child, hiding in closets while the world raged outside. The irony is impossible to ignore: the same isolation that once protected him had returned, this time without walls. And then there is the question of intent, not in the simplistic sense of suicide or accident, but in the deeper question of agency. By 1970, how many of his choices were truly his own? The pills were prescribed. The wine was shared. The environment was saturated with substances normalized by everyone around him. Responsibility dissolved into a fog of assumptions. Someone else will check on him. Someone else knows what he's doing. Someone else is in charge. In the months that followed, testimonies shifted. Memories softened or sharpened depending on who was asking. Financial disputes surfaced. Personal belongings vanished. People who had been inseparable during his life became unreachable in death. The man was gone, but the machinery surrounding him kept moving, reorganizing itself, protecting interests, smoothing rough edges. What remains, decades later, is not just a tragedy, but an uncomfortable ambiguity. Hendrix didn't simply burn out. He thinned out, stretched between too many roles, too many expectations, until there was almost nothing left for himself. His final hours sit at the center of that tension, not as a dramatic climax, but as a quiet, suffocating moment where exhaustion finally outweighed resistance. And somewhere inside that unresolved space between carelessness and consequence, between rest and escape, there is a story still unfolding, one that refuses to end neatly, because the forces that shaped it were never fully seen, named, or held accountable. In the end, the truth does not arrive like a revelation. It does not burst through the door with evidence neatly arranged. It seeps in slowly, through repetition, through patterns, through the weary consistency of human behavior when fame, money, and exhaustion collide. Jimi Hendrix did not die in a dramatic blaze, despite what the mythology prefers. There was no final chord struck in defiance, no symbolic gesture worthy of the posters that would later line bedroom walls. His last hours were quiet, almost painfully ordinary. A rented flat. Heavy curtains. A body that had not slept properly in years finally giving in to chemical rest. The tragedy is not that he wanted to disappear but that so many systems around him made disappearance feel like relief. When investigators closed the case, they were closing a file, not a question. Cause of death satisfied procedure. What remained unexamined was the environment that led there. A man conditioned from childhood to endure chaos silently. An artist trained to comply, to smile, to perform even when his inner life was collapsing. Hendrix had learned early that survival meant adaptation, not confrontation. He carried that lesson into adulthood, into fame, into an industry that rewarded obedience disguised as freedom. Those closest to him, when pressed years later, speak not of suicide but of erosion. Of a man worn down by constant negotiation between who he was and who he was expected to be. Between creative ambition and commercial obligation. Between racial identity and marketability. He was always adjusting, always translating himself for others. The cost of that translation was cumulative. By 1970, he was fluent in everyone else's language and losing his own. After his death, the world took possession of him completely. His image froze at 27, immune to aging, regret, or recovery. Albums were released as if he were still present, still consenting. Interviews were edited. Narratives were simplified. Complexity is uncomfortable. Legends are easier. The boy who hid in closets became a symbol of excess instead of survival. The man who sought rest was remembered for chaos. But if you listen closely to unfinished tracks, to studio chatter, to letters and notes never meant for publication, you hear a different ending forming. Not despair but fatigue. Not nihilism but longing. He spoke of quieter music, of smaller rooms, of reconnecting with people who knew him before the noise. These were not the thoughts of someone chasing oblivion, but of someone craving space. The unanswered questions surrounding his final night remain, and perhaps always will. Timelines blur. Motives are speculated. Responsibility disperses. Yet focusing solely on the mechanics of death misses the larger truth. Hendrix was slowly disappearing long before September ever arrived. Not because he lacked strength but because he was carrying too much expectation, obligation, unresolved grief without permission to stop. What ultimately killed Jimi Hendrix was not excess alone, nor accident in isolation. It was a system that never allowed him to be fragile without consequence. A world that mistook endurance for invincibility. He asked for rest and rest came, tragically permanent. And so, when we return to that quiet room in London, we should resist the urge to romanticize it. There is nothing poetic about exhaustion finally winning. The real story, the one still worth telling, is not about how he died, but about how thoroughly he was consumed while alive, and how easily brilliance can be mistaken for resilience. Because behind the feedback, behind the flames, behind the myth, there was a man who needed what he never learned to demand. Silence, protection, and the right to step away before the world took the last thing he had left. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you like this story.